Okay, to make up for last week's classes, we have a few screencasts. This is the first. We had left off in class talking about Peter Paul Rubens working in the city of Antwerp in the Baroque period, the 17th century. Remember that Antwerp was part of Flanders, which was known as the Spanish Netherlands in the late 16th and early 17th century. It was under Spanish rule. It was under the rule of Philip IV, who we looked at when we talked about Velazquez. During this entire period, it was at war with Holland, the 80 Years' War, which lasted from 1568 to 1648. That war was fought primarily over the issues of religion. Holland was Protestant, Spanish Flanders was Catholic, as was Spain. That means Rubens is also Catholic and very much interested in the Counter-Reformation and in the Council of Trent and its rules for art. He had been to Italy during Caravaggio's lifetime. He had seen Caravaggio's works as they were hot off the presses, so to speak, as they were brand new. Unlike so many other artists that we've looked at, however, he doesn't seem to pick up much from Caravaggio. His works are much more colorful. The lighting is less theatrical, less artificial. Caravaggio's followers love this spotlighting that you see in the calling of St. Matthew on the left. Whereas Rubens's, while it's brightly lit, doesn't really have that Caravaggio lighting. Instead, Rubens offers us a different solution to Counter-Reformation ideas about how art should look. It, too, is clear. It, too, is very realistic and accurate. It, too, is dramatic and emotional. He's just using slightly different means to arrive at the same end. For Rubens, it's primarily handled through the human body, this amazingly muscular and very triumphant Christ, carrying the weight of the meaning of this piece. He is about to be killed, but you'll notice with his arms raised over his head rather than out to the sides, it's almost as if he is already triumphant over death, knowing as he looks up toward the heavens that God will, in fact, deliver him through this suffering and will resurrect him on the third day. So that triumphantness that we see in the body of Christ helps to add to the emotional impact of the work. Also notice the straining and stressing of the bodies, the massive forms that Rubens loved. When he was in Italy, he had also seen numerous works by Michelangelo, and they have every bit as much an effect on his style as anything else that he had seen, certainly more than Caravaggio had. In this particular case, these vast, massive, muscular bodies have symbolic meaning. Christ is, at this point, carrying the weight of the world, and you'll notice it's almost superhuman strength that's necessary to lift that cross. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 huge muscular men with an old rabbi helping them out, another steadying the cross at the top, but most of them are rippling with muscles everywhere we look. This is because they are raising not only Christ, but the sins of mankind that Christ is bearing at this time. The drama of the piece is enhanced by a few other important elements. You'll notice the strong diagonal composition that runs from the upper left right through the body of Christ to the lower right. That helps to add to activate the scene. We're at a very poignant moment, a moving moment. Action is happening before our eyes. Christ isn't resting on the cross yet. The cross is about to be dropped into its post hole. And you can imagine how that's going to feel on Christ's hands when it happens. In fact, I think you're meant to imagine exactly how much that's going to hurt. In addition to that, the absolute massive scale of the piece also adds to its drama. This was originally part of a triptych, a winged altarpiece. And as you can see, here with some Marymount students on a study abroad trip from a few years back, gives you a sense of the massive and dramatic scale of the piece. This, again, adds to its overall emotional impact. Another more subtle thing that Rubens does to enhance the drama and the impact of the scene is to make it not only a visual spectacle, but to appeal to all of your senses. You'll notice the spaniel in the lower left corner, snarling, growling, barking, brings into your perception the sense of sound. Even the trees in the upper right corner, as the storm gathers behind Calvary, seem to be blowing in the wind, rustling, if you were. So there's this sense that not only are we supposed to look at this picture, but we're supposed to hear it as well. I think Rubens is also very much interested in getting us to think about smells and touch, feeling as well. We had mentioned this before in class, the idea of the spiritual exercises, a devotional practice that was authored by St. Ignatius Loyola in the late 16th century, which was a series of practices that were meant to deepen your devotion by having you not only read religious texts, but imagine that you were actually there, smelling, tasting, hearing, feeling all of the things that you were reading about. Rubens was known to have practiced these spiritual exercises. Bernini did as well, and these enhanced the heightened sense of drama that we actually see in these works. What's fascinating here is that one of the figures that's helping to raise the cross is the Roman centurion Longinus, who was blind during the act, but the blood from Christ's wound ran down his lance, and he wiped his eyes and was miraculously healed. Having seen now the Savior, he converted, became Saint Longinus. And in this particular case, Longinus, who is looking at Christ, you can tell he kind of recognizes what's going on here, whereas the other henchmen are meant to be evil and more involved in the task. Well, this figure that we see actually has the features of Rubens. That's Peter Paul Rubens' own face on St. Longinus. So he has indeed truly imagined himself into the scene as part of it here. And again, that's testament to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola that Rubens himself had practiced. All of Rubens' works have this heightened drama, power, empathic emotion. And down at the National Gallery, we have one of his best works, really, in all of America, a work he painted shortly after the elevation of the cross. The story here is that Daniel was a Hebrew prophet who had been condemned by the king of Persia for worshiping the Hebrew God rather than worshiping the king of Persia, who had proclaimed himself to be a god. So, to condemn Daniel, what he did was he threw him into a pit with starved lions. This was the standard punishment, and he was then going to be eaten alive like so many others had before him. Notice the bones and the skulls inside the pit. But Daniel's prayers preserved him. And so what Rubens has chosen for us here is that dramatic moment when Daniel is released from the pit. The cover on the pit, the stone has been moved away, and Daniel looks out, and they look down surprised to find that he, in fact, has not been eaten in answer to his prayers. All of this is obviously a metaphor for Christ. Christ was put into a tomb sealed with a stone, and after 3 days the stone is rolled away, and Christ is saved from death through his resurrection, if you will, conquers death in the same way that Daniel conquers the sure death of the lion's den. Again, Rubens enhances the human body to carry the weight of the power of the emotion of the scene. Daniel is quite rugged, doesn't look like he's been starving down there very long, but again has that athletic body that Rubens had learned from having seen some Michelangelos in Italy when he visited early in the century. But also the wonderful lions all around, as realistic as any lion. The one in the back growling at those who are about to look down, showing that, in fact, had they come down there, they would truly have been eaten. But but again, Daniel's prayers have saved him. In the foreground, we see one of the lions conquered by prayer, another next to it fighting, playfully perhaps, with the lion next to it. I love the one in the background here, seated with, leaning on his paws. But certainly the pair in the corner here, fighting over each other over those, those remaining bones. And there, Daniel looks almost like he's tickling one of the lions to sleep. Rather charming details in this. But again, some of the most realistic lions, and this is again to enhance the overall story, that these ferocious beasts are there specifically to kill Daniel, and they haven't done so. If you haven't seen this picture at the National Gallery, it's huge. The lions are roughly life-size, and Rubens has put us very, very close to the action. They're snarling right in our faces, which adds to that dramatic impact of the scene. The realism of the lions comes from the fact that Rubens had been able to draw them from life. There was a zoo in Brussels kept by the Archduke of Austria, who was the governor of the Spanish Netherlands, and Rubens was able to see lions there, sketch them from life, and it's drawings like this one also at the National Gallery that gave Rubens the knowledge of lion anatomy and behavior that allowed him then to make a very, very convincing group around Daniel in the lion's den. Again, the size of the piece, and here we can see some people mounting it in the National Gallery. The size of the piece is certainly part of its impact. Absolutely massive work, and even though it's, almost 12.5 feet across the base, almost 9 feet tall, Rubens didn't do this as part of a commission, but rather it was something that he did for pleasure, which is very rare for artists at this point. He did it on spec. He certainly meant to sell it at some point, but he didn't have a buyer ready when he painted it. And it stayed in his collection for 2 more years after he painted it. At which point, in 1618, he received a letter from an English ambassador who was looking to buy some Rubens pictures. And he wrote to him back and he said, "I've got this nice picture of Daniel that I painted a few years back, and by the way, none of my shop assistants helped me. I painted it entirely myself. And I'd like to trade it with you for some works of art for my own collection." And this trade, in fact, took place well before, of course, it made it to Washington. And in return for Daniel in the lion's den, what Rubens got in return were over 100 ancient Roman sculptures, as well as some cash as well. So Rubens is really an interesting character. He's both a fantastic artist, as well as an art collector, as well as a diplomatic ambassador, as we learned on one of the archvices, and perhaps maybe one of the best constituents of the high Baroque style, full of drama, that answers the call from the Council of Trent on how religious art should look. The other major painter working in Antwerp in the Baroque period is Anthony van Dyck, and he was in fact one of Rubens' many assistants in Antwerp. So when Rubens said, "I painted the Daniel and lion's den all by myself," what he meant was that different shop assistants, he had someone who was a specialist in animals, for example, someone who was a specialist in still life. Van Dyck was a specialist in portraiture. None of them helped him on that work. Van Dyck was, in fact, in Rubens' studio when he painted Daniel in the lion's den. He was not a pupil, not a student, but a shop assistant, although he was quite a child prodigy. In fact, this portrait shows Rubens' wife, Isabella Brandt, seated in her finest clothing, in their garden, no less. In fact, here's their garden still. You can visit it in Antwerp, and you can see the gate to the garden there that appears in the back of our picture. She is quite the noble woman, Rubens' wife, painted by Van Dyck. Van Dyck was all about 22 or so when he painted this, 21, 22. Was in fact a child prodigy, had begun painting and painting quite well by the time he was 13 or so. This is probably why Rubens picked him up and brought him into the studio as a studio assistant. But slowly, Van Dyck, as he comes of age, is going to break free from Rubens, forge out on his own and independent career. With an eye to his future and realizing that Antwerp is pretty much dominated by Rubens, he decides he might want to look elsewhere for work. And up in Baltimore, this amazing picture of Ronaldo and Armida, almost 8 foot square, really huge. It was painted by Van Dyck as a presentation piece. It wasn't commissioned either. He painted it specifically to send to the King of England, King Charles I of England, in hopes that he can impress the king enough to give him a permanent position in England, where he can make more of a career for himself than he might in Antwerp, where Rubens is really dominating the scene. In this particular image, I think he's trying to out Rubens. He's trying to impress Charles with really the best work he can do. And for my money, it's one of the best paintings in the Mid-Atlantic region. He really did succeed in this. For example, the scene from the lower right corners, we think about him trying to outdo Rubens. The nude figure in the waves holding the sheet of paper is certainly derived from Rubens' own sea nymphs that appear in the arrival of Marie de Medici at Marseille, which, remember, Rubens had done for the Queen of France. So again, trying to attract the King of England, he makes reference to works done for other royal courts. With that in mind, he also uses works of art that were floating around different royal courts as the basis for his composition. Armida in the center in red and blue with her cape blowing in the wind is a reference back to a very famous picture by Titian that was done for the Duke of Este, the Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso de Este, and had come into the collection of the King of Spain. Anthony Van Dyck is really pulling out all the stops. He's making references everywhere, proving himself to be as good a painter as anyone breathing at that particular time. And indeed he was. It works. He gets the job. But first, before we talk about his work in England, we'll look at what this painting means. The story is a medieval legend going back to the First Crusade in the 11th century. During the Crusade, Ronaldo was a Christian soldier, rather powerful and very, very successful on the Crusades. And so the Muslim faction sent a sorceress named Armida to the Christian camp to cast a spell on Ronaldo. And she makes him fall asleep so that she can kill him. And so we see the moment when that takes place, that she's now cast a spell on our Christian soldier in order to eventually murder him. And here he is asleep. But he is so beautiful, after all, outward appearances, often seen as an embodiment of inner virtue. And to Christians, of course, Ronaldo is a virtuous figure. But she looks down on this man she's supposed to now kill, and he's so beautiful that she immediately falls in love with him. And she herself is converted to Christianity. It's a silly story in the long run, right? And it is very, very xenophobic. It's about, the power of Christianity to convert anyone of another religion, something I don't hold much stock in personally, but nonetheless, for Van Dyck, for Charles I, for a Baroque audience in Europe, this is the way the picture would have been read. Again, it's all drama, use of, again, as we've seen before, diagonals that cut across the composition, that enliven that composition, moves in and out rather than across the picture plane. Lots of gestures, lots of movement, lots of action. And that's all, again, to heighten that emotional appeal, even though this is not a particularly religious scene. It's a historical scene, after all. Well, Van Dyck's picture, as I said, led to an appointment as court portrait painter to King Charles I of England. And in your textbook is this image we have quite a few portraits from Van Dyck in Washington from his period as court painter to Charles I. This is Charles I's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria. She was the French daughter of Marie de Medici, who we saw before, and King Henry IV of France. So the patrons for whom Rubens himself had worked. And again, there's an art break, an art fix on that. Henrietta, this was another of these marriages for diplomacy. She was supposed to ally France and England during this period of wartime. Remember, there's the 80 Years' War plus the 30 Years' War, both being waged at the same time. And so Henrietta's marriage to Charles was not only to produce offspring for the royal line, but also as a form of diplomacy to bring these countries together. She spoke almost no English at all, whereas Van Dyck spoke French fluently, as well as Flemish, as well as Italian, as well as English. And the two of them became very, very good friends. He painted her more than 25 different times. This is really one of the best. She appears on the grounds of the palace. We see a column behind her, the patio that stretches out toward us. If we look over her shoulder, we see a potted orange tree. In fact, this is the first orange tree ever in Europe, because it was Henrietta Maria who had actually introduced oranges into England. We should look at them, however, as a bit of a import object, right? Just like Henrietta Maria herself. Something that doesn't really belong there, that is going to try to thrive in conditions that it wasn't really born to live in. So it holds a sort of dual symbolism, not only of her achievements, but also of her situation in England. She is shown with a court dwarf. We've had other images. We think back to Velázquez, images of dwarfs kept at Baroque courts as entertainment. This seems very uncivilized, and indeed it is. In fact, his nickname, Geoffrey Hudson, was Lord Minimus, right, the little lord. And he was apparently known for his wit. He was a joke teller. And he's shown here with his pet monkey, who we know from court records was named Pug. He had been knighted, right, so Sir Geoffrey Hudson, which elevates into a certain status, but doesn't really make any excuse for keeping a human as a court entertainer, a dwarf around to laugh at. But that is, in fact, what Henrietta Maria and Charles I had done. Now, Charles, we see over here, believed in absolute monarchy. He believed that his power should not be checked, that it was divinely ordained, given unto him and him alone, and that it did not need to be shared with anyone else. He ran afoul of parliamentary government. And even though he believes in absolute monarchy, his total and absolute power, you'll notice that neither he nor Henrietta poses in the costume of royalty. Neither of them are dressed as king and queen per se. The clothes are nice, don't get me wrong, but they are not the royal costume. There's no crowns on either of their heads. Neither of them are carrying a scepter in their hand or jewels on their chests. This is not the standard royal costume on either of them. Instead, they choose other guises. Charles appears as a gentleman out on the hunt, posed regally, very with a lot of status, but at the same time, not appearing exactly as a king. He's a man who deserves this absolute monarchy, who deserves this divine appointment. He is enlightened enough to receive all of this power. For Henrietta Maria, her crown is off to the right, almost out of the picture. In fact, half cut off by the frame. Both of them are cultured aristocrats who deserve their position that has been given to them by God and God himself, divinely ordained with no checks on their power. This all goes back to a sort of political philosophy that Charles I was himself supported, that individuals needed to recognize their leaders leadership unto them, because these people deserve it, because of their outstanding character. We'll pick up Baroque art and move